There are people who drift away without moving. Their bodies stay in the room, but something in their eyes softens, as if a quiet door has opened inside them, leading to a world no one else can see. In that world, everything feels gentler. Thoughts don't have sharp edges. Memories don't ache the same way. And the noise of life becomes something distant, like a storm heard from behind thick walls. For some, imagination is not a hobby. It is a refuge, a secret landscape shaped by longing, intelligence, sensitivity, or wounds too delicate to name. They don't escape reality because they hate it. They escape because their inner world feels like the only place where they can finally breathe. There is a moment, small, fragile, almost invisible, when a person quietly disappears into their imagination. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't come with a pause in conversation or a sudden change in posture. It's subtle, a soft unfocusing of the eyes, a slow exhale, a shift so delicate that even those sitting beside them rarely notice it. But inside, a door opens, a private world awakens, and the mind steps into a space where everything feels lighter, slower, and more forgiving. For many people, this drift begins long before they have the words to describe it. As a child, they learn how to slip away in the middle of noise. During arguments they couldn't control. During loneliness they couldn't explain. During moments when reality felt too sharp for their still forming senses. They discover that imagination can do what life cannot. It can soften pain. It can create meaning. It can stretch time. It can make a small, frightened child feel like they have somewhere to go, even if it exists only in their mind. At first, it happens spontaneously. A thought becomes a scene. A feeling becomes a story. A fear becomes a character who is braver, louder, or stronger than they ever felt allowed to be. This internal shift becomes something their nervous system learns to rely on, a gentle escape hatch whenever overwhelming emotions rise too quickly or life becomes too heavy to hold. And even as they grow older, the pattern remains. During a stressful meeting, their mind paints a different landscape. During a painful conversation, their attention drifts toward a world without conflict. During long walks or silent evenings, thoughts weave themselves into vivid, cinematic experiences that feel more like memory than imagination. People around them may mistake this for distraction. Come back. Where did you go? You weren't listening, were you? But those who escape into imagination are not careless. They are deeply tuned into life, so tuned in fact, that sometimes they need a moment away from its intensity. Their drifting is not absence. It is protection. It is emotional pacing. It is the mind's way of saying, this moment is too much. Let me soften it. Some of the most imaginative people are the ones who learned early that the world outside didn't always understand the world inside them. So they built a bridge between the two, one they could cross whenever reality became too cold, too loud, or too unclear. Imagination becomes a companion, a second presence, a quiet friend sitting beside them, even when they're alone. And the beautiful yet misunderstood part is that imaginative escape is not laziness, avoidance, or immaturity. It is an emotional reflex, a survival rhythm, a way of staying connected to themselves when everything else feels too distant or demanding. In this chapter, the drift is not a flaw. It is a quiet intelligence, a natural movement of the mind toward a space where it can breathe, reflect, and recover without needing permission or explanation. People who escape into their imagination are not running from life. They are gathering themselves, reassembling pieces that reality scattered, finding clarity in the soft landscapes their mind creates. And while others may never see these inner worlds, they shape everything. The way these individuals love, think, create, fear, dream, and understand the world. Imagination, for them, is not an escape. It is a doorway, a place where truth feels less frightening, emotions feel more manageable, and the self feels quietly understood. Every imagination has an origin story, not the fantasy itself, but the reason someone first learned to retreat into it. It rarely starts as a choice. It begins as a quiet instinct, an inner shift that forms long before a child understands what coping means, long before they can name emotions like fear, confusion, or longing. For many, the earliest doorway into imagination opens in childhood, not because childhood is always painful, but because children feel everything with a rawness that adulthood later dulls. A raised voice, a cold silence, a room filled with tension they cannot interpret but can deeply sense, a sudden change in the way someone they love behaves. Children don't analyze these moments, they absorb them. And for some, the outer world becomes something that feels unpredictable, overwhelming, or simply too empty. So they create an inner world that feels familiar, gentle, and theirs. Imagination becomes the place where they can rewrite the parts of life that feel unfinished. A parent who is distant becomes warm in their mind. A situation they couldn't control becomes something they master in their thoughts. A fear they couldn't speak becomes a story they quietly resolve through symbols and scenes only they understand. While other children run outside to play, these children sit quietly, sketching characters, building stories, creating invisible companions who feel easier to talk to than the real people around them. They don't realize it then, but their imagination begins to take the shape of emotional survival. Sometimes the origin is loneliness, not the dramatic kind, but the subtle, everyday loneliness of not being fully seen, fully understood, or fully met where they were emotionally. Loneliness so delicate that adults around them never notice it. Imaginative children fill this space with worlds that don't reject, that don't misunderstand, that don't forget to listen. A quiet place where they can exist without adjusting who they are. For others, the root lies in emotional sensitivity. They feel deeply, they sense moods, shifts, unspoken tensions. Even things meant as a joke cut sharper than expected. Even small losses feel heavier than the moment suggests. Imagination becomes the buffer, a soft terrain where intense emotions can settle without burning them from the inside. And for some, the origin is creativity in its purest form, a mind that naturally expands beyond the immediate world, a brain wired to explore possibilities, meanings, and narratives. Their imagination is not an escape from something bad. It is an entry into something bigger. But no matter the route, one thing remains true. The inner world always starts as protection or connection, a place where the child can breathe in ways the outer world did not yet allow. And as the child grows, the pattern grows with them. They learn to drift during moments of stress at school. They imagine alternate lives when friendships become confusing. They create stories in their mind when emotions feel too heavy to hold. By the time they reach adulthood, their imagination is not just a habit. It is a home, familiar, comforting, always available. But the world rarely understands this origin. People may say, "You're too lost in your thoughts. You always escape reality. You're not present." Yet they never ask what that inner world is protecting. What story first taught them to build it? Which moments of their early life needed a place softer than reality to land? Imaginative escape is not a flaw that suddenly appears in adulthood. It is a survival strategy learned by a child who needed somewhere to go, somewhere to feel safe, somewhere to exist without fear of being too much or too little. And that first inner refuge, whatever form it took, becomes the blueprint for the rest of their emotional life. Behind every imaginative escape, there is a brain quietly working to protect, soothe, and reorganize the emotional landscape within. What looks like drifting is actually a deeply intelligent neurological process, a system designed not to avoid reality, but to soften its impact, reinterpret it, and give the mind time to make sense of what the heart cannot immediately hold. To understand why some people escape into imagination so easily, you have to understand how their brain is wired to process the world. One of the first pieces of this puzzle is the default mode network, a powerful set of brain regions that activates when the mind turns inward. This network lights up during daydreaming, reflection, storytelling, future planning, memory weaving, and emotional meaning making. For many people, this network is quieter, but for imaginative individuals, it is vivid and constantly active. Their brain naturally leans toward inner narrative, toward constructing scenes, toward shaping emotions into imagery. The brain becomes a storyboard, one where reality and imagination blend to create coherence. Another important factor is emotional processing style. Some people feel emotion in quick, sharp bursts. Others feel in long, slow waves that take time to understand. The imaginative mind belongs to the second group. They don't simply experience emotion, they absorb it, swirl it around, examine its edges, and translate it into internal imagery that helps them understand what the feeling is trying to say. In psychology, this is sometimes described as internalized emotional regulation. Instead of expressing, they metabolize. Instead of reacting outwardly, they process inwardly. Imagination becomes the silent room where emotional digestion happens. Then comes another layer, dissociation, not the dramatic kind, but the mild, everyday form. The kind almost everyone experiences while driving long distances, reading deeply, or slipping into a daydream. For imaginative individuals, this gentle dissociation is more accessible. The brain learns early how to dim external input to reduce overwhelm. Not because the person is weak, but because their nervous system is sensitive and highly reactive to emotional shifts. This mild dissociation is not a malfunction. It is a shield, a momentary pause, a neurological timeout that protects them from sensory saturation or emotional flooding. Then there is maladaptive daydreaming, a term often misunderstood. It doesn't mean imagination is a disorder. It simply describes when the inner world becomes more compelling than the outer one, often because the inner world feels safer, richer, or more emotionally predictable. This happens not because the person chooses fantasy over reality, but because their brain has been conditioned to seek meaning and safety inward before seeking it outward. Neuroscientists have found that imaginative individuals have stronger connections between memory, emotion, and creative visualization networks. This means they can replay moments with more detail, imagine future possibilities with more clarity, and create symbolic landscapes that mirror their emotional world. Their brain doesn't just think, it paints. But perhaps the most fascinating element is this. The inner world becomes a mirror, a psychological space where unresolved emotions reappear as metaphors. Loneliness becomes a quiet, empty house. Fear becomes a storm in the distance. Longing becomes a character waiting on a bridge. Strength becomes a light that keeps returning in different forms. The brain uses imagination as a language, a symbolic vocabulary, a way of speaking to itself when spoken words feel too direct or too vulnerable. People often assume that escaping into imagination is avoidance, but the science shows something else. It is integration. It is the mind's attempt to bring coherence to what feels chaotic, a way of processing wounds, hopes, fears, memories, and unspoken needs without overwhelming the conscious self. Imagination is not running away. It is running inward, toward the truth the mind is quietly trying to deliver. For people who escape into their imagination, life becomes a quiet balancing act. One world outside, one world within, and somewhere between these two landscapes, an invisible conflict takes shape, one that is rarely spoken about, but deeply felt. It begins with a simple truth. The inner world feels safe, and the outer world feels demanding. Reality asks for presence, performance, participation. The inner world asks for nothing, only that you enter gently and listen. This creates a tension that others often misunderstand. People might see someone lost in thought and assume they're distracted or careless. But beneath the surface, a deeper emotional tug of war is happening. Part of them wants to stay in the sanctuary they built. The other part knows life continues even when their mind retreats. And this is where guilt begins. A guilt shaped from years of hearing. Pay attention. Stop daydreaming. You're not here. The person learns that their inner world is something to hide, something that makes them seem less present, less responsible, less engaged. But no one sees what happens inside. No one sees how imagination holds the emotions they cannot articulate. No one sees how it prevents overwhelm, how it filtering the chaos of reality into something bearable. So they live with two truths. They need their imagination to survive emotionally, and they fear being judged for the very thing that keeps them intact. The conflict deepens in relationships. People who escape into imagination often love deeply and quietly, but their presence can feel inconsistent to others. They may drift during conversations, not because they're uninterested, but because a single sentence triggered an entire internal scene, a memory, a fear, a hope, and their mind followed it without permission. To others, this looks like distance. To them, it feels like gravity pulling them inward. There is also the conflict of expression. Their inner world is full, rich landscapes, detailed emotions, complex stories. But translating this into words feels impossible. Language becomes too small, too literal, too fragile to carry everything that lives inside them. So they stay quiet. They say less than they feel. They answer simply, even when their mind is full of paragraphs. People interpret this as emotional absence, but it is actually emotional overflow that has nowhere to go. Another layer of conflict lies in the fear of being misunderstood. How do you explain that you disappear, not because you're bored, but because your mind is replaying something from childhood? How do you explain that your silence is not coldness, but a deep processing that takes more time than people expect? How do you explain that imagination is not fantasy, but emotional translation? There is also the fear that if someone knew how vivid the inner world truly is, they would call it unrealistic, or melodramatic, or childish. So the person protects their inner world by keeping it private. They rarely speak about the lives they live inside their head, the alternate scenarios, the symbolic imagery, the emotional narratives. It is too sacred, too misunderstood, too easily dismissed. And then comes the internal resistance, a subtle, lingering voice that says, "Come back, stay grounded, stop escaping." But the truth is, they are not escaping. They are regulating. They are making sense of their emotions in the only way that ever worked. Still, they worry. They worry about losing time. They worry about not living fully. They worry that their imagination, once a refuge, has become a place they hide without meaning to. This creates a quiet sorrow, a longing to participate more in life, mixed with a longing to never leave the place they feel most understood. The hidden conflict is not between fantasy and reality. It is between emotional safety and emotional expectation, between the world that shaped them and the world they built to survive it. And until they understand this conflict, they live with the feeling of being split, present but pulled, awake but drifting, here but not entirely here. There comes a moment in every imaginative person's life when the inner world begins speaking louder than they expect. Not in a way that replaces reality, but in a way that reveals something about it, something they've been carrying, avoiding, or not yet ready to name. This is the turning point. A quiet realization that their imagination isn't just a place to hide. It's a place that reflects, a place that remembers, a place that speaks in symbols, because direct words once felt too sharp. Sometimes this moment happens slowly, during a walk when the mind drifts the way it always does. But instead of creating an escape, it brings back an emotion they buried, a memory they muted, a truth they were not ready to hold. Other times, it arrives suddenly, in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of a stressful day, in the middle of silence, when the mind paints an image so strangely honest it stops them in their tracks. For the first time, they realize their imagination is not separate from their emotional life. It is their emotional life, translated into imagery, metaphors, and internal storytelling. A lonely evening becomes a quiet, empty room in their mind. An unresolved fear becomes a character who won't look them in the eye. A longing they could never speak becomes a scene that repeats itself like a dream trying to finish its meaning. In this turning point, they begin to see the pattern. They begin to recognize that every vivid daydream, every drifting moment, every internal story they return to has roots in something real, something from their past, something from their present, something they feel too deeply to ignore. Reality knocks not through events, but through emotions shaped as imagination. And this is where the inner world shifts. It stops being merely a refuge and becomes a guide. The imaginative person starts noticing the messages hidden inside their inner scenes. Why do they keep imagining places where they feel safe? Why do certain characters appear, disappear, or change ages? Why do some daydreams feel comforting while others feel heavy, like they are carrying a truth that hasn't been spoken yet? These are not fantasies. They are emotional blueprints, maps of experiences they have lived through, or wished they lived, or feared they might. For many, this realization is overwhelming. To suddenly understand that their imagination has been holding their feelings for years, feelings they didn't know how to process in the real world, can feel like discovering a diary written in a language they can finally read. And yet, this turning point also brings clarity, a gentle understanding that nothing is wrong with them. They are not avoiding life. They are decoding it. They are making sense of emotions in a way the outer world never taught them how. This is also the moment when they begin noticing how often their imagination tries to pull them back, not out of resistance to reality, but because there is something inside that still needs sorting, something that still needs to be seen, something that still needs time. It is a realization that feels both grounding and unsettling. The inner world is not separate from reality. It is commentary on it, a mirror held to the parts of their life they cannot fully face head-on. People who escape into imagination often reach a point where they suddenly understand. Their mind is not betraying them by drifting. It is trying to communicate, trying to integrate, trying to heal in the only language it ever learned, through stories that reflect the truth beneath the truth. Reality knocks gently at first, and then more clearly, until they finally understand. The world inside them has something important to say. There comes a time when the inner world no longer feels like a place to escape to, but a place to understand. A place that belongs not apart from life, but alongside it. This is the quiet phase of integration, not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden awakening, but a slow, gentle alignment between imagination and reality. It begins with recognition. A person starts noticing how their inner world reacts before they consciously do. An imagined scene grows heavier after a difficult day. A recurring character appears whenever they feel lonely. A soft, peaceful landscape reveals itself during moments of exhaustion. The inner world becomes a barometer, reflecting what the outer world is doing to them long before they can articulate it in words. And in that awareness, something shifts. The imaginative person realizes their inner world is not the opposite of reality. It is the translation of reality, a kinder, slower, symbolic way for the mind to process what the heart is still learning to hold. Integration means no longer running from one world to the other, but allowing both to speak. Some days, reality takes the lead. The practical tasks, the responsibilities, the conversations, the routines. Other days, the inner world steps forward, offering a metaphor, a scene, a memory replayed in softer colors, whispering an emotional truth they weren't ready to face until now. People often assume integration means giving up imagination, becoming more grounded, more present, more realistic. But for imaginative individuals, integration means the opposite. It means honoring the imagination as a part of their emotional intelligence, not a flaw that needs correction. They begin to see how creativity informs clarity, how reflection informs decision-making, how internal dialogue informs emotional understanding. The inner world stops being a hiding place and becomes an interpreter, a bridge between what they feel and what they are able to express. This integration also softens the shame they once carried. No more apologizing for drifting. No more guilt for needing mental space. No more hiding the vividness of their thoughts. They learn that their mind is not too much. It is complex, sensitive, attuned, and beautifully adaptive. The person also begins to notice how imagination enriches the outer world. Conversations feel deeper because they carry layers of inner reflection. Relationships feel richer because they bring emotional symbolism into connection. Choices feel more aligned because they understand the silent truths their inner world has been showing them for years. Integration is not about silencing imagination. It is about decoding it. It is about realizing that their daydreams were never random. They were emotional messages. Their fantasies were not escapes. They were expressions. Their imaginary worlds were not distractions. They were places built to shelter truths that were too tender to face. And slowly, reality begins to feel different, not because it becomes perfect, but because they approach it with more self-understanding. They know when they need to retreat inward and when they need to ground themselves outward. They learn to trust their emotional rhythms rather than fight them. People who integrate their inner world become some of the most quietly wise individuals, not because they know everything, but because they understand the spaces between thought and feeling, between the spoken and the unspoken, between what is lived and what is imagined. They move through the world with a kind of softness, not fragile softness, but the softness of someone who has walked both inside and outside themselves and learned that both journeys matter. Integration is not a conclusion, it is a coexistence, a gentle acceptance that their imagination was never the enemy. It was the guide they didn't know they were following. In the end, the journey of an imaginative person is not about choosing one world over the other. It is about coming home to themselves, to the quiet truth that both worlds belong to them, both worlds shape them, and both worlds hold pieces of who they are. This final chapter is not a climax. It is a gentle exhale, a closing of the eyes, not to drift away, but to feel the soft merging of inner and outer landscapes, finally existing without conflict. For years, their imagination served as refuge, a place to breathe when life pressed too hard, a place to be seen when reality overlooked them, a place to feel when expression felt dangerous or too vulnerable. Now it becomes something else, a companion rather than a shelter, a voice rather than a hiding place, a mirror rather than a mask. They begin to trust the language of their inner world, the metaphors, the recurring scenes, the quiet symbolic imagery that rises whenever something needs attention. They know now that their imagination is not fantasy. It is truth wrapped in softness. And with that understanding comes a deep, quiet acceptance. They were never too lost in their thoughts. They were navigating an emotional landscape the only way they knew how. They were translating life into scenes because the heart often speaks in pictures long before it speaks in words. A soft return to self means letting go of the old shame, the feeling of being different, distracted, too dreamy. They recognize now that imagination was not a flaw. It was resilience. It was connection. It was the mind's way of protecting the parts of them that reality wasn't gentle with. And slowly, something unexpected happens. Life begins to feel more colorful. Not because the outer world changes, but because their perception does. the line between imagination and reality isn't erased. It is softened, blended, allowed to coexist without judgment. They start to see meaning in everyday moments, the way a ray of sunlight falls across the floor, the way a conversation lingers in their mind, the way silence carries its own emotional vocabulary. Their inner world doesn't steal them away anymore. It walks beside them, a quiet guide, a source of insight, a reminder of the emotional truths they once buried and now understand. The imaginative person learns that presence doesn't mean shutting down the mind. It means letting both worlds breathe at the same time. It means being here, in the moment, in the body, in the story of their life, while carrying the depth of imagination as a companion, not a replacement. And perhaps the most touching part of this return is the self-compassion that grows within them. They forgive themselves for the years spent drifting. They forgive the child who needed escape. They forgive the adult who misunderstood that escape is weakness. They forgive the world for not knowing how to read the language of their inner life. In that forgiveness, something soft unfolds. Clarity, peace, and a sense of self that feels both grounded and expansive. The imaginative person becomes someone who can navigate reality with depth, while holding the richness of the inner world with grace. Someone who knows that their mind is not divided. It is layered. It is textured. It is capable of holding multiple emotional truths at once. And as they move forward, the inner world no longer feels like a place they retreat to. It feels like a place they carry. A quiet strength, a private wisdom, a soft reminder that they have always had more depth than anyone realized. This is the quiet beauty of returning to oneself. The realization that imagination was never an escape from life. It was a bridge toward understanding it. And now they can walk that bridge freely, without fear, without shame, with a gentle, enduring sense of who they are, inside and out.